Hello, this is Jeffrey Williams. Welcome to Too Late for the Gods. On Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity, William Lane Craig appears on a recent video entitled Dr. Craig Rebuts the Best Atheist Arguments, to which I've linked below. I'm convinced that Craig is a dishonest apologist who knowingly presents false arguments and empty rhetorical tricks not to actually convert anybody, but to play to his own audience of the credulous. In this video, we will analyze and refute all of his rebuttals and demonstrate Craig's malfeasance. We'll start with one of his preliminary remarks before going on to the actual rebuttals.
I did preview the clips, and I have to honestly say, Cameron, that if these are the best atheist arguments, then the atheist side is in real trouble because these are so superficial. In fact, in the lot, there isn't a single argument for atheism, and our viewers will see that if they watch carefully as you go through them. There isn't a single argument that is given to show that atheism is true. In fact, a lot of what these videos are is just comedy, or more accurately, ridicule. And that's a deliberate strategy adopted by the atheist side. People like Richard Dawkins have said explicitly, we should not engage in debates with people like William Craig because that gives them credibility. Instead, what we should do is use ridicule and mockery of religious views. And that is a very deliberate strategy that you'll see adopted in several of these videos.
Did I just see Craig dismiss with mockery those whom he accuses of mockery? As we will see, this is one of Craig's favorite deceptions. Under cover of accusing somebody else of intellectual dishonesty, he uses that misdirection to commit the same act that he projects onto the other person. There is a bit of irony in his dismissal as superficial. People like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins. Like them or not, they are anything but superficial. Or his dismissal of comedy and satire as unserious. Perhaps he's never heard of William Shakespeare or Jonathan Swift, both of whom demonstrated that there is no more fitting response to the ridiculous than comedic ridicule. As we will see throughout, there has been a great deal of projection in Craig's assertion that the 14 points to which he responds are superficial and lacking any real argument. The first of the 14 responses concerns Hitchens' comment regarding the occurrence of miracles. Hitchens argues that the breaking of all the laws of the physical universe is far less likely than a natural explanation.
It is more likely that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake. And in each case you must, and especially if you didn't see it yourself and you're hearing it from someone who says that they did.
All right, so that's clip number one.
What Hitchens is expressing here is the old problem of the identification of a miracle. And I think his question was correctly posed. Which do you think is more probable? Now, in assessing that probability, it's important to take into account whether you have good evidence for the existence of God. Because if you have good evidence that there is a personal creator and designer of the universe who set the laws of nature and their boundary conditions, then there exists a being who is capable of suspending the laws of nature in the way that Hitchens describes. And it could well be that in the case of a significant religious and historical context, such as the unparalleled life and ministry and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, that the balance of probability would be that in this case a divine miracle has occurred. And that's exactly what I would argue.
Apologetics, especially since Plantinga, has been forced to concede quite a bit. In his development of Reformed epistemology, Plantinga retreats from a claim of proof of God to a plea to accept that under certain assumptions, it is at least reasonable to believe in a God. A sort of universal if preceding the apologist's otherwise unjustifiable premises. But to even make that work, he had to insist that we loosen the requirements for properly basic assumptions to include testimony and belief, something that the earlier rules of foundationalist epistemology would not admit. Here we see Craig put that to use while trying to conceal the concessions Plantinga and the Reformed apologists made. He claims that if we posit a God who created the rules of the universe, this God could also suspend those rules and perform a miracle, providing a logical explanation for the miracle. The problem, which we will see Craig try to evade through rhetorical trickery in the next cut, is that there is no compelling reason to assume a God. He somewhat indirectly applies that the Christian narrative is so unique that it does compel us to make that assumption, but again, we are not compelled to accept that claim either. Many other religions make the same claim with equal justification or lack thereof.
Excellent. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to add there other than to say that this kind of seems like some Humean reasoning, like David Hume's old argument against miracles. It's like no amount of testimony is going to overcome this kind of initial improbability that miracles face. And you've interacted with a lot of people on this question. Give me like what's your response to that, to like the Humean argument against miracles?
The Humean argument was formulated back in 1783 before the modern probability calculus was understood. And so Hume's argument against the probability of miracles is demonstrably mathematically fallacious because he neglects certain key elements in the probability calculus. All he considers is, what is the probability of the miracle given the general background information, the laws of nature? But what he fails to consider is the likelihood of the evidence occurring on the hypothesis of a miracle compared to the likelihood of the evidence occurring on the hypothesis that the miracle did not occur. And if that ratio is great, it can easily outbalance any improbability of the miracle on the background information alone. Now, what I just said a moment ago would also suggest that the probability of the miracle on the background information alone can't be shown to be highly improbable if there is a God who is capable of intervening in the universe and suspending its laws. And so I think we need to include in the background information not just the laws of nature, but also the existence of God as established by the cosmological, teleological, moral, and so forth arguments.
He starts by dismissing Hume as ignorant of the modern probability calculus and claims entirely without explanation how that mathematical theory would improve the likelihood of miracles. It's simply a throwaway designed to impress the naive. The calculus couldn't really be applied to the truth of a miracle, but if one were to make the attempt, it wouldn't get very far. The calculus assigns a value of 1 or 0 to every statement under a set of rules. For example, if a statement is a tautology, its probability is 1. If the statement is a self-contradiction, its value is 0. Statements such as Jesus was a man who rose from the dead is a self-contradiction because men cannot rise from the dead and would be assigned a value of 0. For the obvious reason, Craig doesn't actually apply the probability calculus, but instead gives a misleading account. His claim that Hume erred in calculating probability according to the laws of nature gives the false impression that modern probability theory would allow statements with a value of 0 or statements with no determinable probability, but would skip and tip the scale in favor of miracles. But that isn't how probability works. He makes a similar error other places in his attempt to apply Bayesian analysis to prove that intelligent design is more probable than evolution, even though it is impossible to make such an analysis through the Bayesian methodology. Bayesian analysis requires that all the factors come from the same and relevant data set operating under the same rules. The problem is that the only data set we have and the only rules we know appear after the beginning of the universe, that initial inflation. But to understand the likelihood of the creation of our particular laws of nature, we would need to observe the data set of the pre-universe state of affairs from which our laws developed to understand, in order to understand anything about that probability. Of course, that's impossible. So his focus is solely on post-Big Bang occurrences, which tell us nothing at all about the likelihood of the laws which were enabled by whatever existed before the inflation. In short, he's obfuscating, and he knows it. Let's look at his exact words a bit more carefully. Craig states, demonstrably mathematically fallacious. What he fails to consider is the likelihood of the evidence occurring on the hypothesis of the miracle compared with the likelihood of the evidence occurring on the likelihood of the hypothesis of the miracle not occurring. An utterly meaningless statement. First, the question isn't one, the likelihood of the evidence. The evidence is either apparent and valid, or it isn't. It's a 1 or a 0. The likelihood centers on the hypothesis. As I said, he knows this is mumbo jumbo, so he pivots away in hopes that nobody has noticed and reverts back to what Plantinga had already conceded with his universal if. The likelihood of the laws of physics alone can't be shown to be improbable if there is a God. Well, if there is a God. But that simply returns us to the original weakness in all this. There is nothing compelling in the premise there is a God. His argument now is a mere baseless claim that miracles occur because there is God. No more and no less, despite his dishonest attempt to use high-sounding language to say nothing at all. Plantinga conceded that the Kalam ontological argument was fallacious, but would be reasonable if we simply inserted the word if before the assumptions. Plantinga didn't make that concession just for the fun of it, but because the rules of foundationalist epistemology made it impossible to successfully argue for the existence of God without the if. Yet here Craig attempts to regain ground already conceded to resurrect the pre-Plantinga insistence on the truth of the various false proofs of God, and dropping the if as he concludes, Hume would need to include on the background information not just the laws of nature, but also the existence of God as established by the cosmological, teleological, moral arguments, and so forth. And that is a direct quote from the video. Rather than establishing anything, every one of those alleged proofs was refuted long ago as containing obviously false or questionable premises and fallacies such as special pleading and category errors. Nobody outside the Hermetic cadre of apologists still takes those arguments seriously at all because they establish nothing at all.
Why should they take offence that I don't believe in their God or any other God? And I'd say to them, you know, tell me the reasons why you don't believe in all the other gods, and that's the reason I don't believe in yours. And I've got nothing against people believing in God at all, you know. In fact, if it, you know, did make you a kinder person, if you only did good things in his name, then great, you know, but there's the rub. It's when I see some of these religious fundamentalists saying that they've told their 5-year-old children that if they turn out gay, they will burn in hell. That, to me, is child abuse.
Well, there are a number of points here. He's saying that he is tolerant of people who want to be religious, so long as they do not engage in behavior that injures others. And of course, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. One can similarly say we can be tolerant of atheists so long as they do not engage in behavior such as Leninist Stalinists did in the old Soviet Union that hurt others as well. So the principle would be exactly the same.
No, William, the principle isn't exactly the same. And as somebody with a PhD in philosophy, you certainly know you just committed the fallacy of equivocation. The example that Ricky Gervais gave stems directly and solely from Christianity. Stalinist horrors came directly and solely from the brutality of totalitarianism and communal economics, not atheism. Two different and unrelated categories. There are Christian Marxists, but no Christian atheists. We'll count this as just one more example of Craig's dishonesty. He continues.
One correction, though, would need to be made. He says the reason he doesn't believe in the God of Christianity is the same reason that Christians don't believe in the gods of, say, Islam or some other religion. And that's simply not true. What he's assuming is that there is no evidence for any of these religious beliefs and that therefore they're just arbitrary. But if you have good arguments for Christian theism, such as I've offered, then it's simply not true that my reasons for disbelieving in, say, Islam are exactly the same as arguments that might be offered against Christian theism.
Again, he repeats the same baseless claim that Christianity possesses more evidence than other religions, which simply is false. We see him repeat this throughout as a leitmotif. Then he pivots to an outright lie.
Here's clip number 3.
I just want to say as well, I don't know of any Christian parent who says to his child, if you are gay, then you're going to burn in hell. That's, I think, a cruel caricature. I don't know of any Christian parent who says such a thing.
Yeah, that was actually a good point. My wife brought that up. She was like, who is telling their 5-year-old kid that they're going to spend eternity in hell if they're gay? It's like, Christians don't do that. It's just a weird thing to say. Yeah, and it also is kind of like a caricature of Christian theology, right? The Bible doesn't teach that homosexuals are sent to hell. It teaches that unrepentant sinners send themselves to hell.
There are countless examples of evangelical Christians threatening their kids with hell, including for homosexuality. The most interesting aspect of this answer is that Craig and Pertuzzi feel the need to deny it.
Don't you sometimes feel sad about breaking all these myths apart?
No, because I think it's some myths are deserve to be broken apart out of respect for the human intellect. That no, when you're writhing on the ground and froth is coming out of your mouth, you're having an epileptic seizure. You have not been invaded by the devil. We got this one figured out, okay?
I like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Unlike some of these other folks, I feel like he is a credible person and good-natured as well. He's using the word myth here in the popular sense of falsehood, not in the sense of a literary form. And I would agree with him that insofar as you equate myths and falsehoods, then we need to use reason and intellect to expose them. With respect to demon possession, I'm skeptical of the claim that it's been proven that there is no demon possession. This is not an area of my expertise, but I don't see any reason to think that demon possession is impossible and never takes place. So I'm rather skeptical of that sweeping claim on his part.
Craig tries to imply that myth isn't necessarily untrue, but that it was only a later popular definition that gave myth that connotation. Craig's claim is baseless and ignores the original use of mythos in Greek. In ancient Greek, the word was used to mean story or fiction, and was contrasted to logos, which referred to that which can be demonstrated. From its very conception, myth has implied fiction. He then claims the demon possession has not been disproved, thereby evading the burden on the claimant to prove its existence, and the fact that not only does no such proof exist, but scientific evidence demonstrates purely mundane causes for what were once thought to be possessions.
Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
Well, Kevin, this isn't serious critique. This is comedy. Indeed, it's mockery. And so he sets up a caricature which he then makes fun of. The Christian conception of God is not a man in the sky. It's a transcendent, personal creator and designer of the universe who is the locus and source of absolute moral goodness.
Craig claims the Christian concept of God is not a man in the sky. Perhaps he's never heard of the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Again, Craig tries to evade criticism he can't counter by dismissing it as unserious. It is satiric comedy, however, which has been used for millennia for serious criticism and can't so easily be brushed aside. George Carlin is exposing the conflict between a loving God and one who monitors your every thought and deed with the threat of eternal damnation. This is an essential feature of Christianity, and it's fun to watch Craig try to squirm his way out of it.
And the list of 10 things, I take it that that's a reference to the 10 Commandments. And it's neither the teaching of Old Testament Judaism nor Christianity that if you break any of the 10 Commandments, God is going to send you to burn in hell and to torture you. Rather, what Christianity is like, if I can give an analogy, is that it's like a condemned criminal who has been found guilty of a capital crime and sentenced to death and is on death row. And then the governor or the president, out of mercy, bestows upon him the offer of a complete pardon for his crime, which the guilty person is then either free to accept or to reject. And if he rejects it, then of course he will fall back onto the just desert of the justice system and the sentence will be carried out. So it's entirely up to us whether or not we want to accept God's loving and gracious pardon for our wrongdoing, or whether we choose to reject his love and forgiveness.
It is true that for most of the Old Testament, there is no concept of being thrown into hell for violating the commandments. Although according to the myth, there certainly was some retribution for some of those unfortunates wandering Mount Sinai when the commandments were handed down. But eternal damnation is more of a Christian invention. Let's look more closely at what Craig presents as the Christian concept. A loving God has thrown us into a world where we are already judged guilty at the time of our birth for breaking these commandments and sentenced to eternal damnation. However, if we are one of those born into this absurd predicament who happened to be convinced of the divinity of Jesus, we can choose pardon. Of course, this would render God a perverse monster and the world a joyless and cruel joke. Despite Craig's pretense of understanding superior to the crude comedian, he ends up reinforcing Carlin's message.
God that our neighbors believe in is essentially an invisible person It's a creator deity who created the universe to have a relationship with one species of primate. Lucky us. and he's got galaxy upon galaxy to attend to, but he's especially concerned with what we do, and he's especially concerned with what we do while naked.
Now, it's no part of Christian theism to say that the entire universe was created for Homo sapiens on this planet. For all we know, there could be intelligent life forms scattered throughout the universe. And if there are, I believe that God loves them and is concerned about them just as much as he is about us.
Here, Craig claims it is not a point of Christian theism that God created the universe just for us. Of course, the whole intelligent design movement holds that as its primary premise. Otherwise, what was the point of the design? And nowhere in the Bible is there even the slightest hint of other life in the universe, just the opposite. Genesis describes the mythical creation of the entire universe with Adam and Eve as the crown of creation. This is just more dissembling on Craig's part to distract from the absurdity of creating an unimaginably vast universe for the purpose of man's existence in one microscopic speck. In fact, Craig argues just the opposite when he defends intelligent design.
And when you think about the point that Harris is making, it's very peculiar. Doesn't he think that sexual ethics are important? That it's important whether we treat, for example, women with respect or as mere objects? Does he think that rape is morally indifferent? If there is a loving God who created us, shouldn't he be concerned about how we behave towards one another, and especially with regard to sexual ethics? I would think a God who was indifferent to that would not be a good God. So apart from the sort of good comedic timing that he has, I don't see anything in what his remarks, that was substantive or important.
Here we see Craig purposely strawmanning Harris's point. Harris was obviously referring to sexual behavior between consenting adults, and Craig is obviously evading the Christian condemnation of sex outside marriage, homosexuality, and certain sexual practices other than traditional intercourse. Bringing rape and other non-consensual acts of aggression into the conversation is a red herring designed to deflect from the point he can't counter, while he also facilely dismisses the claim as mere comedic timing. But then Craig is directly confronted with this issue in the next clip. Watch for the straw manning and the equivocation.
Just because they're offended by someone being gay, it doesn't mean they're right. You know, it's a strange thing that comes out of being gay is a choice. No, being gay isn't a choice. You know, I want to go, well, go, you try it then. If it's a choice, have a go. See how much you like it, you know.
Well, the implication here, I take it, is that if having a homosexual orientation is not a choice, if this is somehow either biologically based or it's ingrained into you by your upbringing so that involuntarily you have such an orientation, that therefore you are morally free to act out on that orientation. And that seems to me to be an extraordinarily superficial and even dangerous view of ethics. Imagine, for example, that pedophilia was not a choice, but had a biological base or was ingrained into someone by child abuse as a youngster. Would that person therefore be free to simply act out on that orientation and do as he wills? I don't think we'd say that at all. So the fact that something isn't a choice in no way warrants or sanctions ethically acting out on whatever those desires or proclivities might be.
The strawmanning starts when Craig suggests that the implication of homosexuality not being a choice does not mean we are morally free to act out. Of course, the argument was quite different, that homosexuality is morally neutral and any condemnation of it is unjust. And also that Christians claim that homosexuality is a choice that can, for example, be overcome through the quackery such as conversion therapy. It then presents false equivalency between homosexuality and congenital defects that incite one to violence. The two have nothing to do with each other, and Craig is simply obscuring his real belief that homosexuals are not entitled to a fulfilling sex life simply because of their inclination. And this after earlier proclaiming the central role sexuality plays in the human experience. It is a sign of great moral progress that people like Craig can no longer just come out and say this without being dismissed. He ends this point with more of the projection I mentioned at the beginning.
It's really bizarre.
It is astonishing, and I think it shows clearly the superficiality of much of pop atheism in our culture. It's comedic, it's ridicule and mockery, but there are not substantive reasons for what they believe.
This is amusing when we realize Craig is a pop apologist who throughout this video displays superficiality and a lack of anything approaching a legitimate argument.
Do you give people who make this case that that was the beginning and that there had to be something that provoked the beginning, do you give them an A at least for trying to reconcile faith and reason?
I don't think they're reconcilable.
What do you mean?
Well, so let me say that differently. All efforts that have been invested by brilliant people of the past have failed at that exercise. They just fail. And so the track record is so poor that going forward I have essentially zero confidence, near zero confidence that there will be fruitful things to emerge from the effort to reconcile it.
Before you respond, what do you think the probability is that he's read Where the Conflict Really Lies by Alvin Plantinga?
Zero. I mean, it's very, very clear that Dr. Tyson is not well read in this area. He's just sharing his opinion.
This coming from a man with pretensions to understanding physics, but was shown to be an empty fool when he dared to debate Sean Carroll on cosmology. What do you think the odds are that Craig has read Einstein's 2 volumes on relativity or any of the seminal papers on quantum field theory or multi-worlds theory? As Craig goes on in his response, he ironically demonstrates the irreconcilability between Christian faith and science.
And that's evident in the way the question is framed. Faith and reason, are they reconcilable? Those are such general terms as to be meaningless. What in the world is even meant by faith and reason?
No, William. The context makes clear what is meant, and you are again trying to obscure a point you can't refute. Faith here means a belief in the word of the Bible. Reason means scientific interrogation of the physical world. Either you are a dishonest hack or a dullard unable to follow the conversation.
Now, what he goes on to talk about is the opening chapter of Genesis. That is apparently what he thinks he means by faith, and that all efforts to reconcile that with science have failed. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. As the interviewer suggested, the idea that the universe had a beginning at some point in the finite past and was created by God, as Genesis declares, is fully reconcilable with modern astrophysical cosmology, which also posits an absolute origin to the universe about 13.8 billion years ago.
And he has the nerve to call others superficial, claiming that Genesis parallels modern cosmology is laughable, and again reveals Craig to be a dishonest hack or a fool. Let's consider his claim that modern physicists have determined the universe has a finite beginning. This misleads for two reasons. First, there are important physicists such as Roger Penrose who posit we are just a small pocket of a much larger eternal universe that continually gives birth to new universes out of itself. That is the opposite of finite. Second, even among physicists who believe that our universe had a finite beginning almost 14 billion years ago, there is a recognition that that description misses the larger point of what existed before our universe came about. That is, the Big Bang was a change in state, not a finite beginning. Genesis describes a void before our universe came about, whereas modern physics understands that something existed before the initial inflation, but we can know nothing about its state because the very laws of physics by which we understand reality only arose post-inflation. The very idea of finite infinite is probably an illusory dichotomy, as Kant pointed out in the first antinomy. And our current universe is simply a change in state from an earlier physical state that Craig misrepresents to accord with the biblical account. The misrepresentation is effected through Craig's use of the words absolute origin of the universe, when it is more likely it wasn't absolute, but a continuation.
Also, the fine-tuning of the universe is consistent with the biblical affirmation that it's God who is the ultimate creator of the universe and all of its biological life forms.
Few, if any, prominent cosmologists agree that there is any valid argument for the claim that a being fine-tuned the universe for our existence. In fact, such a claim can easily be shown to be a tautology, as one has to assume the universe was created just for human existence to conclude the universe is fine-tuned, or as mentioned earlier, employ an invalid use of statistics. Again, this argument contradicts Craig's previous statement that there is nothing in Christian ideology that supposes the idea of man as a privileged goal of creation. One universal characteristic of a fraud is the willingness to substitute contradictory claims according to the situation.
The extraordinary applicability of mathematics that we've talked about on previous Capturing Christianities is also completely reconcilable and compatible with a religious perspective on creation, such as you have in Genesis 1. So it's demonstrably false that faith and modern science cannot be reconciled, as the way Dr. Tyson says.
I wish Craig had gone on to explain how a seeming correspondence between reason and reality points to a God, but it doesn't matter because the very claim itself reveals a complete ignorance of post-Kantian epistemology, evolutionary psychology, and modern neuroscience, all of which demonstrate the conflict between subjective reason and a world that operates outside that constraint. Epistemology since Kant has posited that reason is our innate and inherited principle according to which we make subjective sense of a chaotic external world. Evolutionary psychology traces how this facility developed as our unique adaptive advantage. Modern neurology backs this up with demonstrations of how our brain constructs its own coherent reality out of the chaos of sense data by imposing its own conditions of thought, which have evolved to work well within the very narrow band of reality we have inhabited, but break down at the macro level of relativity and the micro level of quantum physics. In short, through innate reason and the sensibilities of space and time, we project our subjective creation onto the external world. Seen in the light of science, Craig's claim of extraordinary applicability of mathematics to the external world, which diminishes at the macro and micro levels of reality and disappears altogether as we approach the singularity before inflation, is simply false. Craig again repeats his claim that it is demonstrably false that faith and reason cannot be reconciled after failing to show any reconciliability at all. But then he suddenly abandons the claim that Genesis is compatible with a scientific explanation by reversing and claiming that Genesis isn't offering a natural account of the origin of the world anyway. In other words, he simultaneously claims that Genesis is an accurate account of the origin of the world, and never mind, because it wasn't meant to be anyway. Pure double talk.
Now, with respect to the Genesis account, it's very important to understand that this is not offering a natural account of the origin of the world. This is an account that works with the presuppositions of the culture and the assumptions that were made by those to whom it was written to make the theological point that the stars and the sun and the moon, the animals, the things in the world are not deities, as was believed in ancient Mesopotamia, but rather these are just ordinary, natural things which the transcendent God has made. And that central theological point is not dependent upon the sort of worldview assumptions that may be taken for granted in this chapter. It's not a chapter about cosmology or biology. It's a chapter about how God is the source of the things in the natural world, and that therefore they are not to be worshipped.
Well, yes, it certainly is written within the naive and ignorant presuppositions of the people of that time, which of course is exactly what you expect from man-made myth. My guess is a real God might have been a bit more accurate. If the point were to differentiate God's word in respect to the deities of stars and other natural objects, one might expect he would have made that point a bit more explicit and tried to differentiate it a bit more from the earlier Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, from which it appears he did some heavy borrowing.
We have a couple minutes. Why don't we talk for just a couple minutes about the evolutionary argument against naturalism and why Plantinga thinks that science is ultimately in conflict with naturalism as opposed to theism?
Yes, this is a very subtle argument that Plantinga has defended in great depth, and it's basically this. If naturalism is true, then our cognitive faculties have been selected for survival value, not for truth. It's ultimately irrelevant whether or not our beliefs are true. What matters is only if they are beneficial in the struggle for survival. And so what Plantinga says is that if naturalism is true, we can have no confidence in the reliability of our cognitive faculties. But if that's the case, then we can have no confidence in the truth of naturalism, because the belief in naturalism was formed by those very cognitive faculties which are shown to be unreliable if naturalism is true. So there is a kind of vicious circularity here, a kind of self-referential incoherence that is inescapable on a naturalistic worldview, because naturalism will undermine the reliability of the very cognitive faculties that were used to establish naturalism.
This argument is often used by amateur apologists who, along with Craig, have no idea what they're talking about. What they think is a subtle argument is their claim that naturalism denies the ability to know anything as true. And since the naturalist method of inquiry depends on capacities that have been selected for survival value and not for truth, it cannot know that we evolve consciousness based on adaptive advantage. Of course, that is a gross distortion of the argument and a false assumption that survival value did not include some element of truth. That the primary evolutionary impetus was survival does not mean there is no correspondence at all between our representations and reality. It would have had no evolutionary benefit at all if that were the case, because we would not have been able to distinguish between predator and prey. The epistemological progress we have made is in determining the limits of knowledge, not that we cannot know anything at all. For example, an understanding of epistemology can tell me that I cannot know what is in a locked box, although I know that such a locked box exists. It doesn't imply I cannot know anything, but rather that making metaphysical assertions about the unknowable inside of the box is a fool's game. In addition, there is nothing in the naturalistic of understanding of consciousness that precludes our further intellectual development to investigate reality within our limitations to further true knowledge in addition to survival.
Many people claim to find it impossible to believe or to imagine that they won't exist after death. Just try it for a second. I mean, you imagine that everyone in Paris right now is getting along fine without all of us. I mean, none of us are in Paris. We are really, really materially absent from whatever is going on in every other city on this planet right now. You were absent for all of human history before your birth. The idea that you simply can't imagine not existing after death is really kind of just for lack of trying, I think.
Yeah, or comedic again. I've never met anyone, Cameron, in my life who has difficulty believing that they will die and no longer exist. I've never met anybody who thinks that that's unimaginable, that they would not exist after they die. On the contrary, they would need good grounds for thinking that they will continue to exist after their death. What I would say in response to Harris is people who think that they cannot continue to exist after they die are the ones who haven't been trying very hard. They're the ones who lack imagination. Those who think that when you die, it's lights out and that you don't continue to exist. That may be a lack of trying in its own right.
Well, perhaps Einstein's problem was he lacked imagination. As he said, neither can I believe the individual survives the death of his body, or though feeble souls harbor such thought through fear or ridiculous egotisms. Or maybe it's too much imagination sparked by fear that creates the delusion of an afterlife. If we refrain from imaginary comforts and concentrate on reality, there is no reason at all to believe in an afterlife.
If someone said, we're banning religion, I'd march to not have it banned, because it's your right to believe what you want. And it's your right to be wrong. And I'll fight for that right.
Great, that's wonderful. That's what tolerance really is. I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death to defend your right to say it. And I applaud him for understanding the correct meaning of toleration in a civil society.
Well, good. Then we all agree about tolerance. I assume that includes the tolerance of atheists and their right not to be governed by biblical precepts. I've ignored Cameron's responses to this point as irrelevant and uninteresting, but here I'll make an exception.
Yeah, well, what do you think about this? Because, I mean, talk of right seems like it might presuppose morality or at least moral knowledge. And moral knowledge, on the other hand, kind of conflicts with atheism. So in one sense, this might be an argument for theism as opposed to atheism.
No, Cameron, your ignorance is once again showing there is no conflict between moral knowledge and atheism. The error is thinking that morality derives from Christianity. Morality has been around a lot longer and more broadly than Christianity. And as we have progressed, we have moved steadily away from the primitive and brutal morality of the Bible.
Ha, that's a clever response, Cameron. Perhaps the best thing that he might say in response to that would be that he's talking about political rights rather than moral rights. Perhaps as an atheist, he would recognize that you have no moral rights to anything, but that in a pluralistic society governed by the U.S. Constitution or in Great Britain, you have the political right to freedom of religion. And
Well, if you're going to play,
that certainly is a valuable right that is under great pressure today, not from the right, but from the left. People who want to suppress that freedom of religious expression. So this is something we need to applaud and agree upon.
And Craig shares Cameron's ignorance. We not only have political rights, we have freedom of conscience, which means we are not bound to Christian morality or any other dogma. We have a right to believe as we choose, and that includes a morality that contradicts Christianity. Again, Craig falsely presupposes that Christianity is the source of all morality and any other source is invalid. What happened to that tolerance he had just mentioned?
They're not
If you
very
knew nothing about
substantive.
science and you read, say, the Bible, the Old Testament, which in Genesis is an account of nature. That's what that is. And I said to you, give me your description of the natural world based only on this. You would say the world was created in 6 days and that stars are just little points of light, much lesser than the sun. And in fact, they can fall out of the sky, right? Because that's what happens during the Revelation. One of the signs that the second coming is that the stars will fall out of the sky and land on earth. So to even write that means you don't know what those things are. Everybody who tried to make proclamations about the physical universe based on Bible passages got the wrong answer. Right. So what happened was when science discovers things and you want to stay religious or you want to continue to believe that the Bible is unerring, what you would do is you would say, well, let me go back to the Bible and reinterpret it. Then you'd say things like, oh, they didn't really mean that literally, they meant that figuratively.
There's so much to say about this. For one thing, notice the confusion between Genesis 1 and the book of Revelation. Genesis 1 says nothing about the stars falling from the sky. That's from a work of apocalyptic literature employing lots of symbolism. And
hundreds of years later.
Yeah, right. So he's just confused there.
Whenever Craig accuses others of being confused, this is a signal he is about to confuse the issue in order to obfuscate. Tyson clearly distinguished the star as being in Revelations and not in Genesis, in making the point that biblical descriptions of the cosmos share a common ignorance typical of the people at that time.
Now, when you get to Genesis 1, as I said, the purpose of Genesis 1 is not to give an account of nature. It is not a science book. The purpose of Genesis 1 is to show that the things that exist in the world are just creatures rather than deities to be worshiped and served. That God is the transcendent creator and designer of everything that exists.
Here we have a repeat on the B theme of Genesis, that it's not a natural description, but a theological message that physical objects are not deities. Again, it's too bad there's nothing in the creation myth to back that up, and the Genesis myth does in fact purport to explain the creation of the universe. But as we'll see, Craig can't leave it at that, and we have a reprise of the A theme that Genesis indeed does portray an accurate development of the cosmos.
And honestly, if you read Genesis 1, it really gives you a very logical order of creation, beginning with darkness, and then a primordial sea, the emergence of dry land, and then vegetation and animals, and finally man as the very last, the crown of creation on earth.
And here we have man as the crown of creation again, which he tried to avoid in the argument of man's insignificance in the vast universe. This guy just can't keep his story straight. More to the point, his claim that Genesis gives us a coherent and logical order of creation is laughable. God starts by creating heaven and earth, and then created light and separated it into day and night. Craig would have us believe that it was possible to create the light of the universe before stars formed, and that day and night existed before Earth's orbit and spin. Next, God created a firmament, which was like a dome that divided the waters of earth from heaven, and also somehow gets confused with separating land from water. Of course, no firmament actually exists. Craig would also have us believe that it is chronologically logical that God now brings forth all the plants before stars even exist. That would mean we would have to believe that before stars existed and created the elements and provided heat and light, somehow water, earth, and plants existed. This is what he calls chronologically logical. And all this avoids mentioning the second creation story in Genesis, which follows a wholly different chronology. He would have been much better off sticking to his claim that Genesis is not a description of nature after all, as lame as that evasion was.
I say, fine, pray for anything you want, pray for anything, but what about the divine plan? Remember that? The divine plan. Long time ago, God made a divine plan, gave it a lot of thought, decided it was a good plan, put it into practice. And for billions and billions of years, the divine plan has been doing just fine. Now you come along and pray for something. Well, suppose the thing you want isn't in God's divine plan. What do you want him to do? Change his plan? Just for you? Doesn't it seem a little arrogant? It's a divine plan. What's the use of being God if every rundown schmuck with a $2 prayer book can come along and f*** your plan? And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. Fine, but if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why bother praying in the first place? Seems like a big waste of time to me.
Now here, Cameron, I think a Molinist perspective on prayer can be very helpful in understanding this. As the comic said, God put a lot of thought into this divine plan. And I believe that one of the things that he took into consideration was how people would pray in the future. And he factored that into his divine plan when he made it, so that God's plan already factors in our prayers and can take account of them. So what that means is that while our prayers do not change God's plan, they do affect God's plan. They help to determine what God's plan is, and that alone gives good reason to pray.
There is really nothing funnier than the inventiveness of apologists when confronted with the contradictions of their beliefs. The convenient thing about metaphysics is that you can always amend or redefine your way around any of these contradictions, because you're never restrained by reality, only by the limits of your imagination. Here Craig appeals to the 16th century Jesuit Luis de Molina, who attempted to resolve the conflict between God's infallible foreknowledge and free will. Typical of metaphysical speculation, which survives yet today in theism, it is an imaginary solution to an imaginary problem, and was a hot topic among metaphysicians in the 1500s. It attempted to resolve this conflict by inventing what was called middle knowledge, which stood between God's absolute knowledge of necessary truths and God's knowledge of his own will. In this middle knowledge stood all possible contrafactuals concerning the decisions a free will would make in all possible situations. God then conforms his creation in advance by taking into account what these free wills would decide in the future. All this does, however, is bury the contradiction in the middle knowledge, since if it is possible to predict an action that cannot be a free will could always surprise you at the last moment, just like the exact position of a photon. To be 100% predictable, an action must be the result of a causally determined chain, rendering free will impossible. Once again, the mere superficial comedian sees more clearly than Craig. Next, Cameron only makes things worse.
I have two more things on that one. So petitionary prayer is just one type of prayer, and I think the atheist, when they try to raise objections to Christianity, prayer in particular, they like to point to one type of prayer, petitionary prayer, and say that prayer is therefore pointless because this one type of prayer, maybe there's not a whole lot of evidence that it works or whatever they think it is. And I just wanted to point out that there are many types of prayer. There's prayers of gratitude, prayers of adoration, prayers of confession, prayers of lamentation, and there's even prayers of silence. Some people pray in the form of just being silent and sort of listening to God.
Yeah.
Now, if Cameron wants to join the upper ranks of grifters, he will really need to improve his game. All he attempts here is to obscure the contradiction by listing other types of prayers that aren't affected by this contradiction. We often call this a red herring.
Okay, just think about the Muslims at this moment who are blowing themselves up, okay, convinced that they are agents of God's will. There's absolutely nothing that Dr. Craig can say against their behavior in moral terms, apart from his own faith-based claim that they're praying to the wrong God. If they had the right God, what they were doing would be good on divine command theory. Now, I'm obviously not saying that Dr. Craig or all religious people are psychopaths and psychotics, but this to me is the true horror of religion. It allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. Okay, if you wake up tomorrow morning thinking that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, okay, you have lost your mind. Okay? But if you think more or less the same thing about a cracker and the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic.
Now, here again, I think atheists so often fail to realize that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. The same point applies to Harris's view. On the naturalistic view, on atheism, plausibly there are no objective moral values and duties, and therefore millions and millions of people can engage in horrible and despotic acts, such as we saw in Marxist-Leninism or in Nazism in National Socialist Germany.
Notice how Craig begins with misdirection. The point Herrick makes is that religion contains irrational beliefs that would be considered insane in an individual because they contradict all known reality, logic, and are without evidence. Because that is an obvious fact that one cannot attack head-on, Craig pivots to his belief in an objective moral law in order to claim that naturalism also fails to provide a solid objective basis for morality. Besides equivocating irrational belief with objective morality, Craig also offers a false choice between objective moral law and no basis for morality at all. As a PhD in philosophy, certainly he is aware that he just committed the fallacy of bifurcation. The third choice is morality based on an innate sensibility that provides no legal code, but does provide emotional guidance toward the moral. Basically, Craig has conceded that a rationally derived moral law, such as Harris's, and a metaphysically derived moral law are equally ungrounded. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. The third option of innate sensibility offers the advantage of grounding in something knowable, our own nature. And in the end, all understanding of morality actually does stem from our innate nature, regardless of claims otherwise. Then he makes his case even worse.
And the same question could be posed of Harris. He thinks that the basis of objective moral values is the flourishing of sentient life. Well, I could say, but what if the flourishing of sentient life were not the basis for objective moral values? Then what? Then you would have nothing to say other than your faith-based claim that the flourishing of sentient life is the basis of moral values. It's the same thing that he accuses me of. Now, what I would say with regard to the Muslim is that the Muslim is worshiping a God who doesn't exist. There is no such person as Allah as described in the Quran. And therefore, we can be grateful that moral values and duties are not determined by Allah. Rather, moral values are rooted in the essential nature of God himself, which is necessarily good, is not a result of human convention or arbitrary decision, and that his commands to us reflect his necessarily good moral nature. So I think this provides a very firm, non-arbitrary, non-conventional basis for objective moral values and duties, something that I do not think atheism can do.
Again, what is good for the goose is good for the gander, and the entire non-Christian world can, with equal justification, claim that Craig believes in a God that doesn't exist, and that any moral code derived from this imaginary God is ultimately the product of men interpreting from their own innate sensibility. But here he takes his obfuscation one step further. At the heart of the Christian objective moral law, as espoused by Craig and others, is that God grounds objective moral law out of his own nature, which is purely, essentially, and solely good. This leaves evil ungrounded and therefore unexplained. And on this point, his claim directly contradicts Isaiah 45:7, where Yahweh proclaims, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, Yahweh, do all these things. Craig also has a PhD in theology and is well aware of his obfuscation here, and therefore must know his argument is simply false. But truth is not valued by the apologist. If we are going to ground morality in a nature, it can only be our own nature, which contains both light and darkness, to stay within the oversimplified biblical dichotomy, since it is the only nature we know actually exists. The moral is that innate sensibility that champions our inner light over the darkness. And to top it all off, Cameron chimes in to destroy his own point.
I did want to say something else, though, about the end of it. He says that religion can make otherwise sane people believe insane things. And I want to say that science can make otherwise smart people believe some insane things, quote unquote, insane things. And all that we mean by that is that there are some claims that have a very low prior probability. Just on the face of it, they seem really weird, okay? Take a scientific example. Atomic theory implies that most of the things that we interact with are made up mostly of empty space. That seems like an insane thing to believe until you start to gather evidence for atomic theory. In quantum mechanics, there's a thing called quantum entanglement, where two different particles, we have a lot of evidence now that this happens across vast distances, where two particles can start to do some of the same things faster than the speed of light. There's this sort of spooky action at a distance, according to, that's what Albert Einstein said about it. And so there's things that we discover in science that just seem wacky on the face of it, but really what matters, and this is the same thing when it comes to Christianity religion, really what matters is not the prior probability of something, but the evidence for it and whether or not we have good reasons to think that thing is true in the long run.
Cameron is obviously not one of the brightest people around, and here he unwittingly destroys the point he thought to make. It is true that religion provides countless impossible and irrational examples. It is also true that contemporary physics presents things that are counterintuitive. As Cameron points out, though, the only important deciding factor is evidence. We accept superposition, entanglement, relativity, etc., even though they directly contradict our prior rational understanding, because we have solid evidence for their existence. There is no evidence for religious irrationality and therefore no reason to accept it. The counterintuitive aspect of science results from the hard limitations of our faculties of understanding, which simply cannot grasp the true state of macro relativity and micro quantum activity. In the religious examples, we see the opposite, the difficulty of an untrained mind to distinguish objective reality from illusion. Craig then rushes in with some more obfuscation to cover up Cameron's mess.
Yes, key to Harris's statement or argument, and the audience may have missed this, was the word faith-based. He characterized the theistic view as faith-based, which suggests there isn't any evidence for it. But as you say, Cameron, if we have good evidence for the existence of God and for grounding moral values in God, then you escape his criticism. On the contrary, I think it's Harris's view that it's faith-based. I can't think of any reason on a naturalistic, atheistic view for thinking that the flourishing of sentient life is somehow morally valuable.
Again, Craig invokes the giant if, but there is no evidence of his God, and he repeats his fallacy of bifurcation concerning the grounding of morality. And now for the 14th and final response.
Probably going to be the most simplest one for you to answer, but what if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you've been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. I mean, there's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which by the sheerest accident you happen to have been brought up, and ask me the question, what if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong about the great Juju at the bottom of the sea?
Now, it was very obvious to me that Richard Dawkins was thinking on the fly there, that he was taken off guard, and the question morphed from the question the girl asked to a question about religious pluralism.
More than a little irony in that, the guy who has been morphing issues all throughout now accuses Dawkins of this as he morphs Dawkins' response. This is another example of Craig's favorite rhetorical trick. Under cover of accusing someone else of intellectual dishonesty, he proceeds to commit that very thing. To be clear, Dawkins was pointing out that the questioner was not speaking from some privileged ground of knowledge and could be equally wrong. The result is that if we are to take her premise seriously, that there is one true God on whom our salvation or damnation rests, it could just as easily be one of the gods she rejects. The point is, nobody is in a position to make that determination. To avoid that predicament, Craig gives a superficial denial by dismissing it as religious relativism, whatever that might mean in this case.
What the girl was, I think, trying to express, Cameron, was Pascal's wager, so that she would be very happy with the question posed by Dawkins at the end, what if you were wrong? And she would say that when I estimate the risk rewards involved, the risk of being wrong is much, much greater for the atheist than it is for the theist. because if the atheist is wrong, he risks forfeiting eternal happiness and eternal life. Whereas if the theist is wrong, all he forfeits is the pleasures of sin during this lifetime. So that the risks of being wrong, she's arguing, are much, much greater for the atheist. And that should give the atheist significant pause, I think, before confidently expounding his worldview.
And that is exactly the rhetorical trick he employs. It might be argued that the risk-reward for the atheist is much more than the theist, but of course that evades Dawkins' point. Rather, Dawkins point out that the risk-reward for the atheist is exactly the same as for the Christian in light of all the other gods.
Now, what Dawkins does, as I say, is to try to shift the question to the question of religious pluralism that says that the beliefs that a person typically holds are the beliefs of the culture in which he was raised. Well, of course, that's true sociologically, but so what? That doesn't prove that therefore your views are false. To think that it does is to commit the genetic fallacy, which is trying to invalidate a point of view by showing how the person came to hold it. And that is a logical fallacy. If somebody says, well, the only reason that you believe that democracy is the best form of government is because you were raised in 20th century America, well, that might be true, but that doesn't prove that your belief is therefore false. Moreover, the argument is, again, it's another one of these sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If Richard Dawkins had been raised in Pakistan, he would likely be a theist. He'd likely be a Muslim. Does that therefore mean that his belief in atheism is unjustified and therefore false? Well, obviously not. So the very argument that he's using against theism, namely its cultural relativity, bounces back on him and would make his own atheistic beliefs unjustified and false.
Another of those false choices Craig is so famous for. Ignoring for the moment the impact of probability on this decision, which in favoring the atheist greatly mitigates the risk, let's look at the mischaracterization of the rewards. For the Christian, the reward would be a promised heaven of some sort, the details of which are unknown. But if the atheist is right, his reward is nothing like what Craig tries to minimize and dismiss as the temporary enjoyment of sin. I sometimes think only a former believer can fully appreciate how much is gained by the unburdening of religion. But it is found in the overwhelming joy of freedom and the sudden profound appreciation of this strange, alluring, and almost impossible life we suddenly find ourselves immersed in. When I realized Christianity was false and emancipated myself from slavery to Jesus Christ, that ad Christodoulosian delusion, several things overcame me. First was the immense relief from the self-imposed paranoia of some judgmental God listening to my every thought and knowing my every action. How perverse that sort of life was. Next came the immense relief of no longer having to lie to myself in order to maintain faith. And with this came the immense joy of freedom, freedom to enjoy my life, to deeply experience and explore what life in this world really is. With the rejection of metaphysics, including religion, I for the first time saw the vibrancy, profound musicality, and unfathomable wonder of this very physical world that I, for no earned reason at all, was so improbably given to enjoy. That is what I win in this wager and would not choose any other way.